Sir, put the paddle down. Margaret Whitmore's voice cut through the auction room just as Adrian Cole raised number 117 for the third time. He didn't lower it. At the front of Wellington House's grand auction hall, Daniel Mercer stood beneath a wash of warm gallery light, one hand resting beside his polished wooden hammer. 2.8 million, Daniel announced. Do I have 2.9? Adrian lifted his paddle higher. Number 117. Impossible to miss. Daniel's eyes moved across the room. For half a second, they landed directly on Adrian. Then they moved past him. A white-haired collector seated 3 rows ahead raised his paddle. Daniel immediately pointed. 2.9 million. Thank you, Mr. Langford. A ripple of excitement moved through the room. Adrian slowly turned his eyes toward Robert Langford. Langford's paddle had gone up after his. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Adrian. He raised number 117 again. Margaret stepped directly into his line of sight. Elegant black dress. Pearl earrings. Silver auction house badge pinned near her shoulder. Her smile was professional. Her eyes were not. Sir, she whispered, you need to stop. Adrian looked at her. Stop bidding. You're disrupting the auction. Behind Margaret, Daniel continued. 3 million. Adrian raised the paddle. Margaret shifted sideways, blocking him again. That was when Adrian understood. The first time could have been an oversight. The second could have been bad timing. But this? This was a choice. He lowered the paddle just enough to look past her. 3 million. His voice carried farther than Margaret expected. Several heads turned. Daniel hesitated. Robert Langford glanced over his shoulder. Margaret's jaw tightened. Mr. Cole, bids are recognized by the auctioneer. Then perhaps the auctioneer should recognize them. A few whispers moved between the rows. Margaret leaned closer. You were told to keep your paddle down. Adrian's expression remained calm. No. You told me. The distinction landed. Near the side wall, junior auction assistant Sophie Grant looked down at her tablet. Bidder 117. Adrian Cole. Registered. Verified. She frowned. There was no hold on his account. No bidding restriction. No warning beside his name. Nothing. At the front, Daniel lifted the hammer slightly. 3 million to Mr. Langford. Adrian looked at Langford's paddle. Then at his own. His had been raised first. Again. Margaret stepped closer. Put it down. Adrian met her eyes. His voice dropped until only those nearest could hear. Why? He glanced toward Daniel. Then back at her. Afraid he might see it. For the first time that evening, Margaret Whitmore had no immediate answer. And across the room, Sophie Grant began checking the bidding log. 20 minutes earlier, no one had paid much attention when Adrian Cole walked through the doors of Wellington House. That was exactly how he preferred it. No driver waiting outside. No assistant carrying a portfolio. No recognizable entourage announcing that someone important had arrived. Just Adrian in a charcoal suit, polished black shoes, and a dark overcoat folded over one arm. At registration, Margaret Whitmore had looked up from her tablet. Invitation. Adrian handed it to her. She scanned the card, then looked at him again. Which collector are you representing? Myself. Margaret paused. You're bidding personally. That's usually what a paddle is for. Her smile tightened. A registration clerk beside her entered Adrian's information. The screen refreshed. Adrian Cole. Bidder 117. Verified. Margaret leaned toward the monitor. Was financial clearance completed? The clerk nodded. Before noon. Margaret lowered her voice. At what level? The clerk checked. Then checked again. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Full authorization. No bidding limit listed. Adrian noticed the reaction but said nothing. Margaret handed him paddle 117. First time with Wellington House. First time bidding here. That explains it. Adrian studied her. Explains what? But Margaret had already turned toward the next arriving couple. Enjoy the auction, Mr. Cole. Now, 20 minutes later, Adrian sat in the same room watching Daniel Mercer recognize Robert Langford's $3 million bid, a bid that had come after his own. Sophie Grant stood near the side wall, scrolling backward through the electronic bidding log. 2 for million. Bidder 117 had raised his paddle. No recognition. 6 million. 117 again. No recognition. Then Langford. Accepted. Sophie frowned. She checked Adrian's registration profile. Verified. She opened the Financial Clearance tab. PI authorized. No restrictions. No compliance flags. Nothing that justified what she had just watched. At the front of the room, Daniel continued smoothly. 3 million with Mr. Langford. Do I hear 3.1? Adrian raised his paddle. Margaret immediately moved closer. Mr. Cole. He kept his eyes on Daniel. 3.1. Daniel glanced toward him. Then toward Margaret. It was subtle. Almost invisible. Margaret gave the smallest shake of her head. Daniel looked away. Adrian saw it. So did Sophie. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't an auctioneer missing a paddle in a crowded room. This was coordination. Robert Langford raised his number. Daniel pointed immediately. 3.1 million. Thank you. A murmur of approval moved through the audience. Adrian lowered paddle 117 onto his knee. Margaret seemed relieved. She leaned closer. Thank you for cooperating. Adrian finally turned toward her. I'm not cooperating. Her expression stiffened. I'm watching. Margaret straightened. Sophie stepped away from the wall and approached her. Ms. Whitmore. Not now. It's about bidder 117. Margaret's eyes flicked toward Adrian. What about him? He's fully verified. Margaret's face remained perfectly composed. Sophie continued quietly. And his bids were valid. For 1 second, Margaret said nothing. Then she looked at Sophie with a coldness that made the younger woman stop. You're new here, Margaret said. Let me handle the room. Across the aisle, Adrian watched them. He couldn't hear every word. He didn't need to. He had already seen Margaret's signal. And now he knew something far more important than the price of the painting. They weren't failing to see paddle 117. They had decided not to see the man holding it. Adrian raised paddle 117 again. Daniel Mercer saw it. This time, there was no question. Their eyes met across the auction room. 3.2 million, Adrian said. Daniel's lips parted. Then his gaze shifted toward Margaret. She gave the same almost invisible shake of her head. Daniel turned away. 3.2 million, he announced, pointing toward Robert Langford. Langford had only just begun lifting his paddle. A few guests applauded softly at the rising price. Adrian didn't. Neither did Sophie. She stared at the timestamp on her tablet. Bidder 117, 8:42 and 16 seconds p.m. Bidder 204, 8:42 and 19 seconds p.m. 3 seconds. Adrian had been first by 3 full seconds. Sophie opened the previous round. The same pattern. Then the round before that. Again. 3 valid bids. 3 ignored paddles. 3 opportunities redirected toward Langford. Sophie walked quickly toward Margaret. Miss Whitmore. Margaret kept watching the auction. I told you. Not now. This can't wait. Margaret turned. Sophie held the tablet between them. Look. Margaret barely glanced at it. Bidder 117 raised first at 3 separate price points. I'm aware. Sophie froze. You're aware? Margaret's expression warned her to lower her voice. There are considerations you don't understand. He's registered. That doesn't mean we have to encourage him. Sophie stared at her. He's financially cleared. Margaret stepped closer. People like him sometimes register for the experience. The words hung between them. Sophie's brow tightened. People like him? Margaret said nothing. That silence answered more than words could have. Several feet away, Adrian couldn't hear the exchange, but he could read Sophie's face. Shock. Then disbelief. Then anger. At the front, Daniel continued. 3.2 million with Mr. Langford. Looking for 3.3. Adrian lifted his paddle. Not quickly. Not desperately. Deliberately. Daniel saw him. Margaret saw him. Sophie saw them both. Nobody spoke. Adrian kept number 117 raised. 5 seconds. 6. 7. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, Langford raised his paddle. Daniel seized the escape. 3.3 million. Thank you, Mr. Langford. A murmur swept through the room. Adrian slowly lowered his arm. Robert turned in his seat and looked directly at him. There was no confusion in his expression. Only satisfaction. Adrian leaned back. His anger never reached his face. That was what unsettled Margaret. He wasn't protesting anymore. He was studying them. Sophie returned to the side station and quietly opened the auction room camera archive. She synchronized the video with the electronic timestamps. There it was. Adrian's paddle rising first. Again. 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 3 separate bids. 3 separate recordings. Proof. At the front, Daniel raised the hammer. 3.3 million with Mr. Langford. Adrian stood. The movement alone silenced several rows. Margaret immediately stepped toward him. Mr. Cole, sit down. Adrian looked at Daniel. Then Margaret. Then at paddle 117 in his hand. His voice was calm enough to make the room lean closer. I wanted to know whether you were making mistakes. He paused. Now I know you're making choices. Sophie looked down at the evidence glowing on her screen. And for the first time that evening, Margaret Whitmore looked worried. Then show me the rule. Adrian remained standing. Margaret stopped beside his chair, her professional smile now stretched thin beneath the auction room's warm lights. Mr. Cole, this is not the place. It became the place when you stopped recognizing valid bids. Whispers moved through the rows. Daniel Mercer shifted behind the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could continue, not yet. Sophie's voice surprised even herself. Margaret turned sharply. Sophie approached with the tablet held against her chest. I checked the bidding log. Sophie. And the room footage. Margaret's expression hardened. Return to your station. Sophie didn't move. Bidder 117 raised first at 3 separate price points. The room quieted. Robert Langford turned fully in his chair. Daniel stared down at his notes. Margaret lowered her voice. You do not discuss internal records during a live auction. Then correct the bids. That's enough. Sophie looked toward Adrian. He gave her no encouragement. He didn't need to. The evidence was already doing the work. Margaret stepped closer to Sophie. You're new here. There are procedures you don't understand. I understand timestamps. A few guests exchanged looks. Sophie unlocked the tablet. 2.4 million. Bidder 117 first. She scrolled. 2.6. Bidder 117 first. Again. 3.2. Bidder 117 first. Daniel's face tightened. Margaret reached for the tablet. Sophie pulled it back. And his account is fully verified. No restrictions. No compliance flags. Adrian watched Margaret carefully. Then what exactly is the problem? Margaret looked at him. For a moment, nothing came. No policy. No financial issue. No registration error. Only irritation. You're disrupting a private sale. Adrian lifted paddle 117 slightly. I'm participating in one. A nervous laugh came from somewhere in the room. Margaret's cheeks flushed. Daniel tried again. We currently have 3.3 million with Mr. Langford. Adrian turned toward him. 3.4. His paddle rose. Every eye followed it. Daniel froze. There was nowhere to pretend he hadn't seen it now. Margaret looked at him. Daniel looked back. That tiny exchange told the room everything. Sophie saw it. Adrian saw it. And several bidders did too. Robert Langford raised his paddle. Daniel immediately pointed. 3.4 million with Mr. Langford. A shocked murmur rolled through the room. Adrian's paddle was still in the air. Sophie stared at Daniel. You just did it again. Silence. Margaret snapped toward her. Enough. No, Sophie said, voice shaking. Everyone saw that. Adrian slowly lowered number 117. Margaret stepped toward him. If you continue interrupting this sale, I'll have security escort you out. 2 security officers near the rear doors looked up. Adrian glanced at them. Then at Margaret. Finally, at the painting glowing beneath museum lights behind Daniel. Evening Harbor. He had come to buy it. Now the room had made the transaction about something larger. Adrian looked back at Margaret. You had my registration. His voice was quiet. My financial clearance. A pause. And now you have witnesses. Near the rear of the hall, security began moving forward. But above them, behind the glass of Wellington House's private viewing room, an elderly woman had risen from her chair. Eleanor Harrington had been watching. And she had just asked one question. Who is bidder 117? 3.5 million. Adrian raised paddle 117. This time, he didn't sit back down. Every face in the auction room turned toward him. Daniel Mercer stared directly at the paddle. Margaret Whitmore stood only a few feet away. There was no blocked sight line. No distraction. No excuse. Daniel swallowed. Then he looked at Margaret. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. Daniel turned toward Robert Langford. Do I have 3.5? The room went still. Adrian's paddle remained raised. Robert glanced over his shoulder, almost amused. Then he lifted his own. Daniel pointed immediately. 3.5 million. Mr. Langford. A wave of disbelief moved through the room. Sophie stared at Daniel. Adrian slowly lowered his paddle. Then he stood completely upright. Are you accepting registered bids tonight? He asked, or only familiar faces? The question carried through the hall. Daniel gripped the edge of his podium. Margaret stepped in. "Mr. Cole, sit down. My bid was first. You've been warned. My bid was valid. You are disrupting the sale." Adrian looked around. Dozens of people were watching now. Several had phones in their hands. He turned back to Margaret. "My money entered this room legally." A beat. "Apparently I didn't." No one laughed. Not at first. Then a man near Langford leaned toward his companion and muttered, "Maybe he thinks the paddle is a reservation card." A few uncomfortable chuckles followed. Adrian heard them. His expression didn't change. Margaret raised 2 fingers. The security officers began walking down the aisle. Sophie moved quickly toward her. "Ms. Whitmore, stop." Margaret ignored her. "I have the footage," Sophie said. "His paddle was first. Every time. Return to your station. If security removes him, the recordings will still show what happened." That made Margaret turn. For the first time, real fear crossed her face. Only for a second. Then it hardened into anger. "You're done for tonight." Sophie stared at her. "What?" "Hand me the tablet." No, the word came softly. But it landed. Margaret stepped closer. "Excuse me." Sophie held the tablet tighter. No, one security officer reached Adrian's row. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Adrian looked at him. "Because I bid on a painting. We've been asked to escort you out. By the same person refusing my bids." The officer hesitated. Upstairs, behind the glass of the private viewing room, Eleanor Harrington watched every movement below. She had heard enough through the room's audio feed. "Bring me the junior assistant," she told an aide. "Mrs. Harrington." The young woman with the tablet. Minutes later, Sophie entered the private room, breathless. Eleanor didn't ask about Adrian's clothes. She didn't ask what company he owned. She didn't ask how wealthy he was. She pointed toward the auction floor. "Did number 117 bid first?" Sophie nodded. "Yes." "Was he registered?" "Yes." "Financially qualified?" "Completely." Eleanor's eyes returned to Adrian below. Security stood beside him. Margaret stood in front of him. And paddle 117 remained in his hand. Eleanor's voice became very quiet. "Then why are they pretending he isn't there?" Sophie had no answer. Eleanor looked toward Evening Harbor. For decades, the painting had hung where her husband could see it every morning. Now strangers were deciding who deserved even the chance to own it. Downstairs, Daniel lifted his hammer. 3.5 million with Mr. Langford. Eleanor rose. "Not anymore." 3.5 million with Mr. Langford. Daniel Mercer raised the hammer. Adrian remained standing beside his chair, paddle 117 resting at his side. He didn't bid again. He had already made his point. So had they. Going once. Robert Langford leaned back with the satisfied expression of a man who believed the room had returned to its proper order. Margaret stood near Adrian, watching the security officers approach. Going twice. Stop the sale. The voice came from the rear entrance. Daniel's hammer froze in midair. Every head turned. Eleanor Harrington stood beneath the archway leading from the private viewing level, one hand resting lightly on the polished wooden rail. Sophie stood several steps behind her. Margaret went pale. "Mrs. Harrington." Eleanor descended slowly into the auction room. Daniel lowered the hammer. "Mrs. Harrington, is there a problem?" "Yes." Her eyes moved past him. Past Margaret. Past Langford. They stopped on Adrian. "Who is bidder 117? No one answered immediately. Adrian lifted his paddle. "I am." Eleanor studied him for a moment. Then she turned to Sophie. Did Mr. Cole offer 3.5 million before Mr. Langford? Sophie looked at Margaret. Margaret's expression warned her. Sophie answered anyway. Yes. A murmur spread through the room. Eleanor looked at Daniel. Did you see his paddle? Daniel's face tightened. I was managing several bids simultaneously. That wasn't my question. Silence. Eleanor repeated it. Did you see him? Daniel glanced toward Margaret. That was enough. Eleanor followed his eyes. Margaret stepped forward. Mrs. Harrington, there were concerns regarding bidder verification. Sophie spoke immediately. No, there weren't. Margaret turned sharply. Eleanor didn't. Explain. Sophie held up the tablet. Mr. Cole was registered before the auction. His financial clearance was completed. There were no restrictions or compliance flags. Eleanor's expression hardened. And his bids? I checked the timestamps and video. Sophie swallowed. He was first more than once. Robert Langford rose. Surely we don't need to derail the entire sale over a procedural misunderstanding. Eleanor looked at him. Easy to call it a misunderstanding when every misunderstanding benefits you. Langford slowly sat back down. Adrian watched Eleanor. She hadn't asked what he did for a living. She hadn't asked what he was worth. She had asked only whether the rules had been applied fairly. That mattered to him. Eleanor turned toward Margaret. Why was bidder 117 ignored? Margaret's composure began to crack. We exercise discretion when protecting the integrity of a sale. From what? Margaret said nothing. Eleanor waited. Still nothing. Then she looked toward Evening Harbor beneath the gallery lights. For a moment, the auction room disappeared from her expression. She saw another room. Another time. Her husband standing before that same painting, telling her that art meant nothing if people treated ownership as more important than seeing. Eleanor turned back. Mr. Mercer. Daniel straightened. Yes, Mrs. Harrington. Do not bring that hammer down. Margaret's eyes widened. Mrs. Harrington, please. Eleanor raised one hand. Margaret stopped. Then Eleanor walked directly toward Adrian. The room watched her cross the aisle. She stopped in front of paddle 117. Mr. Cole, she said, I'd like to know something. Adrian met her eyes. Why do you want my husband's painting? Because I don't want to own it alone. Adrian's answer caught Eleanor Harrington off guard. Around them, Wellington House had gone completely silent. Eleanor studied him. What does that mean? Adrian glanced toward Evening Harbor. My company is building a cultural center in the neighborhood where I grew up. Free admission. Public gallery. Music rooms. Art programs for kids whose families may never walk into a place like this. Robert Langford shifted in his chair. Margaret said nothing. Adrian continued. I saw Evening Harbor 6 months ago in a catalogue. I read about your husband and why he kept it for so many years. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. You researched him. I researched the painting. A pause. Then I understood the man who protected it. Eleanor looked toward the canvas. My husband believed art should be seen. So do I. Adrian raised paddle 117 slightly. If I bought it tonight, it wouldn't go into my office. It wouldn't hang above a fireplace where 6 people see it at dinner. He looked at Eleanor. It would belong to everyone who walked through those doors. Something changed in her face. Margaret stepped forward. Mrs. Harrington, with respect, Mr. Langford currently holds the recognized high bid. Eleanor turned. Recognized by whom? Margaret stopped. Eleanor looked at Daniel. Was Mr. Cole's bid valid? Daniel hesitated. Yes. Was it first? Another hesitation. Yes. Robert stood. Mrs. Harrington, I'm prepared to go higher. Eleanor looked at him. This is not about how high you can go. I can offer 4 million. A ripple moved through the room. Adrian didn't react. Langford continued. 4.2. Eleanor's expression remained unchanged. Mr. Langford, you're bidding on my painting. She paused. You were never bidding on my right to decide what happens to it. Then she turned toward Daniel. Withdraw Evening Harbour from the auction. Margaret's face went blank. Mrs. Harrington, you heard me. Daniel slowly set the hammer down. Lot withdrawn. The words rolled through the room like thunder. Eleanor faced Adrian. You offered 3.5 million. I did. For a painting they refused to let you bid on. Adrian held her gaze. Yes. Eleanor glanced at paddle 117. Then back at him. 3.5 million. Private sale. Same terms as the auction, provided one condition is written into the agreement. Adrian waited. The painting goes where you said it would. A faint warmth entered his expression. The public gallery. The public gallery. Adrian extended his hand. You have a deal. Eleanor took it. For several seconds, no one spoke. The seller had chosen him. Not because he had shouted louder. Not because he had offered more. But because when the room tried to make him invisible, he had remained exactly who he was. Margaret stood frozen near the aisle. Robert slowly returned to his seat. Daniel stared at the unused hammer. Sophie released a breath she seemed to have been holding all night. Then Eleanor turned toward Margaret. One more thing. Margaret looked up. This sale may be over. Eleanor's eyes moved toward Sophie's tablet. But what happened in this room isn't. Sophie, show them. Eleanor's voice carried across the silent auction room. Sophie looked down at the tablet in her hands, then toward Margaret. For the first time all evening, Margaret had nothing to say. Sophie connected the tablet to the main display behind Daniel's podium. The auction catalogue disappeared. A bidding log replaced it. Bidder 117. Timestamp after timestamp. Adrian's valid bids appeared before Langford's. Again. 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 A murmur spread through the room. Daniel lowered his eyes. Eleanor turned toward him. You saw those bids? Daniel hesitated. Yes. And ignored them. His jaw tightened. I was following floor direction. Every face turned toward Margaret. She stiffened. I was protecting Wellington House from an irregular situation. Adrian finally spoke. What was irregular? Margaret looked at him. He waited. My registration? Silence. My financial clearance? Nothing. The way I raised the paddle. Margaret's face flushed. Adrian stepped closer, still holding number 117. Or was the irregular part simply me? The room went still. Margaret looked away. Eleanor's expression hardened. That's enough. She turned toward a Wellington House executive standing near the rear. I expect a formal review before tomorrow morning. The executive nodded immediately. Of course. Not internal theatre. A real review. Eleanor gestured toward Sophie. The records are preserved. So is the video. Margaret stared at her. You're suspending judgment based on one incident. Sophie answered before anyone else could. It wasn't one incident. She lifted the tablet. It was repeated every time he raised his paddle. That landed. Daniel removed his auctioneer's glasses and set them beside the hammer. I should have stopped it. Adrian looked at him. Yes. Daniel nodded slowly. No excuses followed. Robert Langford rose quietly, preparing to leave. Adrian noticed. "Mr. Langford." Robert stopped. "You didn't create the rules tonight." Robert turned. "But you knew when they were benefiting you." Robert's expression tightened. After a moment, he gave a small nod. "I did. It wasn't redemption. But it was the first honest thing he had said." Eleanor walked toward Evening Harbor. The painting remained beneath the gallery lights, untouched by everything that had happened around it. She looked at Adrian. "My husband would have liked where it's going." Adrian joined her. "I hope the kids do too." For the first time that evening, Eleanor smiled. Behind them, Sophie began exporting the bidding records. Daniel stepped away from the podium. Margaret surrendered her auction badge to the Wellington House executive pending review. And Adrian looked down at paddle 117. A piece of painted wood that had somehow become evidence. He placed it carefully on the registration table. Margaret watched him. Adrian met her eyes. "The problem wasn't that you didn't know whether I could afford the painting." His voice stayed calm. "The problem was that you decided my bid mattered less before you knew anything about me." Margaret had no answer. Adrian turned away. The room that had spent the evening refusing to see him now followed every step he took toward the door. But he didn't leave with the satisfaction of having defeated someone. He left knowing something more important had happened. The painting had found its next home. And Wellington House had finally been forced to see what its polished walls had tried to hide. 3 months later, paddle 117 was behind glass. Not at Wellington House. Not in a private collection. It rested inside a simple display case at the entrance to the newly opened Cole Cultural Center, beneath the warm afternoon light pouring through 20-foot windows. Beyond it hung Evening Harbor. Children stood in front of the painting. Some whispered about the colors. Others pointed at the boats reflected across the dark water. One little girl sat cross-legged on the floor with a sketchbook balanced on her knees, trying to recreate the orange light along the horizon. Adrian Cole watched from across the gallery. No velvet rope separated the children from the painting. No invitation was required. No one had to prove they belonged there. That had been the point. The Wellington House review had concluded weeks earlier. The video evidence and bidding records confirmed what Sophie Grant had documented that night. Adrian's valid bids had repeatedly been ignored despite his registration and financial clearance. Margaret Whitmore was removed from her senior position. Daniel Mercer accepted responsibility for following her signals instead of enforcing the auction rules. Wellington House announced new bidding oversight procedures, independent complaint reviews, and mandatory documentation whenever a registered bidder was denied recognition. Sophie stayed. But not quietly. She was promoted into a compliance role where questioning a decision was part of her job rather than a threat to it. Now she stood near the gallery entrance beside Eleanor Harrington. Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on Evening Harbor. "He would have loved this," she said. Adrian knew exactly who she meant. "Your husband?" She nodded. He always hated rooms where people talked more about what art cost than what it made them feel. Adrian smiled. Then he definitely would have hated that auction. Eleanor laughed softly. A boy of about 10 approached the display case. He stared at paddle 117. Then at Adrian. "Mr. Cole." Adrian crouched slightly. "What's up? Why is that number in a glass box?" The question drew Eleanor's attention. Sophie turned too. Adrian looked at the paddle. For a moment, Wellington House returned to him. Margaret blocking his view. Daniel looking away. Langford's paddle rising after his and somehow counting first. Security walking down the aisle. He remembered the strange feeling of being physically present in a room that had decided he was invisible. Then he looked around the cultural center. At families walking freely through the gallery. At teenagers studying photographs on another wall. At children standing inches from a painting that might otherwise have disappeared into a private home. Adrian looked back at the boy. Because sometimes people decide your voice doesn't matter before they've even heard it. The boy frowned. So you kept raising it? Adrian smiled. Yeah. Why? Because their decision about me didn't have to become my decision about myself. The boy considered that. Then he looked again at paddle 117. Did you win? Adrian's smile faded into something quieter. He looked toward Evening Harbor. I got the painting. The boy waited. But that's not the same thing. Adrian stood. Across the gallery, Eleanor understood. So did Sophie. The real victory had never been $3.5 million. It wasn't Margaret losing her position. It wasn't Wellington House changing its procedures. And it wasn't Adrian proving that he had enough money to sit among wealthy collectors. He had deserved fair treatment before anyone checked his bank account. That was the truth the auction room had failed to understand. Adrian looked around the gallery one last time. Hundreds of people had already walked through its doors that afternoon. Nobody asked which collector they represented. Nobody inspected their clothes before letting them look at the art. Nobody decided whose attention mattered more. The boy ran back toward Evening Harbor. Adrian remained beside the glass case for another moment. Paddle 117 sat quietly inside. Once, it had been raised again and again in a room determined not to see it. Now thousands of people would pass it every year. Not as a symbol of Adrian's wealth. As a reminder. Being ignored does not make a person invisible. Being underestimated does not make them smaller. And dignity never begins when someone powerful finally decides to recognize you. It was yours before they ever looked your way.